I'd like to tell you a story about Brian. In his mid-20s, Brian and his girlfriend were very far from God. They were sexually active. But Brian had such a strong addiction to pornography that he was no longer able to be physically intimate. And because of this, he dumped his girlfriend. And he said, referring to this, he said later in life that back then he had a fourth-degree black belt in selfishness. But his intimacy problems continued. And eventually, he and his former girlfriend got back together and they got married in the Catholic Church because she was Catholic. His wife then had a powerful conversion experience of God's love, and 2 years later became a full-time youth minister. As for Brian, he chose to become Catholic a year after the wedding, and his heart slowly grew, and he desired to get some help. So he started going to see Jake Kim, the great Catholic counselor. He himself had overcome an addiction to pornography. And through God's grace and their work together with some failure along the way, Brian eventually found freedom from his sexual sins. And that desire, that freedom, grew into a desire to help other people. So great that he left his work at Investors Group. He started studying at Trinity Western University, and now he's a thriving Catholic counselor, and he's helping so many people find freedom and hope. We've been talking now about the rules of discernment according to St. Ignatius of Loyola, and today we're going to cover Rule 14. And in Rule 14, St. Ignatius says that the devil looks for our spiritual weaknesses and attacks us there. And what's implied in the rule is that if you learn what your weaknesses are, you can strengthen them, and then the devil will no longer have power over you. And God's grace is so great, he can actually take our weaknesses and make them into a strength. So St. Francis de Sales, he had an anger problem, and he's now known as the saint of gentleness. And then St. Augustine, for 15 years, struggling with lust, now he's known as a saint with purity of heart. And on Christmas, I'm going to tell you a story about St. Therese. St. Therese had all these emotional problems up until her early teenage years. And now she's known as a saint of reasonableness, the saint of spiritual maturity. And we see this in the first reading, this truth. God can bring greatness out of a weakness. It says in the first reading, "You, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah, who are one of the little clans of Judea, from you shall come forth for me one who is to rule in Israel." God is so great, he chooses in his greatness to come from this little town, this unknown town. And in the gospel, we also see a similar dynamic. You see this great blessing of maternity, and where do you see the blessing? In two unknowns, unexpected sources. So a virgin becomes a mother, and then an old lady, she also becomes a mother. And there we see God again reversing. From weakness, he brings great strength. Could we just all ponder together these 5 following questions? If you know your weaknesses, then you can strengthen them. Question number 1, ask yourself, is there some situation that frequently discourages me or strips me of spiritual energy? Are there circumstances in which I often become afraid, worn out, or spiritually helpless? Is there one recurring way in which I find myself spiritually weakened? Does one thing seem to diminish most of my energy to love and serve others? And finally, is there something that habitually disheartens me in prayer, that causes me to doubt God's love for me? I really hope all of you start to know yourself better. You really have to know your weaknesses because the devil knows your weaknesses. In Rule 14, St. Ignatius makes a metaphor. He says the devil is like the leader of an enemy army. This army approaches a castle on the hill, and the army pitches camp outside of the range of the defenses of the castle. And then it sends out scouts. And the scouts circle the whole castle and they look for the weak points. And once they find them, they attack right there You have to know, where do you really fall? Where do you really struggle? For some of us, it's our sexuality. The devil will attack us in our loneliness, our frustration, our insecurity. For some of us, we're really spiritually strong, but the devil gets us through our emotions. Our emotions are always up and down. For me, I never basically miss prayer, but the devil will always get me by wearing me out physically when I overwork. For sure, that's a big weakness of mine. For others of us, it's our relationships. God will get you through your family, those relationships, or through your friendships. You might be the person who always follows your friends. And then finally, your health or your finances. So if you're physically sick, that causes you to doubt God's love. If someone you love is physically sick, that will do the same. Or if you're struggling with your finances, then you really feel far from God. Now, the beautiful thing, again, is God changes those strengths into weaknesses. So Brian and his wife, they're great examples. People can overcome sexual sins. And one person here gave me permission just to share. For her whole life, she's always huge ups and downs, huge mood swings. The devil will always get her through her emotions, but not through her spiritual life. But now with self-examination, reflection, prayer, and formation, the devil can't hit her there. He still attacks, but he can't overcome her there anymore. And then some of you, I've seen you've had cancer, and that used to cause you to doubt God's love. Not anymore. You've strengthened that weakness, which is beautiful. There's an interesting point in St. Ignatius' metaphor. He said there's nothing particularly strong about that enemy army. In other words, if the castle strengthens the weak point, that enemy army can't defeat it. That's interesting. Same with the devil. The devil actually can't beat you if you strengthen your weakness with God's help. He can't overpower God. So if you want to know your weaknesses, please go back to those 5 questions. It is now our last week of Advent. Christmas starts on Friday evening. And we've been praying for the people on our 1102 prayer cards. Their names are listed underneath the altar. Really encourage you, again, please keep on praying for those people on your cards. Last week I suggested, could you do an act of love for them? One intentional act of love. And today I'll just specify that a bit more. If you see the people you love struggling with a weakness, tell them that God can overcome that weakness and say, hey, you know what? I notice you're having a difficult time. I'm going to pray for you. Tell them you will pray for them, because all people, even non-religious people, appreciate being prayed for. So tell them that. Tell them God can really turn their weakness into a strength. In the gospel, when our Blessed Mother goes to visit Saint Elizabeth, most of us have been taught that the reason she went was to help an old woman in her final 3 months of pregnancy. That's possible. It's probably not the most accurate reason, because St. Luke tells us at the end of the text, he says, Mary remained with her about 3 months and returned to her home. So a lot of people ask a really good biblical question. If she went to help a pregnant woman, why did she leave just when she gave birth? Because she could use a lot of help after that. Why? Now, it's possible she went back to Nazareth. She has to sort out her relationship with St. Joseph, but there's probably a more strong theological reason, and it's this. The reason Mary went to her cousin Elizabeth is not to help primarily an old woman get around the house and do household chores. The primary reason is because she went to bring her baby Jesus to her cousin and to her cousin's baby. Now, why do we think that? There are 7 words in today's gospel, and in the Greek, the original Greek of the New Testament, those 7 words are exactly or very close to 7 words in the Old Testament when David brings the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. As Catholics, we believe that what is contained inside the Ark, we've talked about this once before, what is contained inside the Ark is fulfilled in Jesus. And that means Mary is the new Ark of the Covenant. She's the fulfillment. And what's really neat about when David brings the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, he first of all brings the Ark to the home of one man. His name is Obed-Edom. And the Ark stays there for how long? 3 months. That's not by accident. So what St. Luke is telling us in the New Testament is that Mary's the new Ark of the Covenant, and so she went to bring her baby Jesus to her cousin. And for us, we're supposed to do the same thing in this last week of Advent and then in the Christmas season. Please bring Jesus to the people you love. Last point. God's ability to bring strength out of weakness and to change us and to improve us, it is so great. Brian not only becomes this great Catholic counselor, he eventually goes on to help the priest who did his wedding, me. So Brian and Krista's wedding was the first wedding I ever did. And now think about this. 14 years later, 14 years after I did their wedding, I'm having all these problems myself. Last year, I can't sleep. I'm so stressed out. I take my 10-week sabbatical. Who do I go to for counseling? Brian. That's unbelievable. Brian has grown so much in his prayer, in his maturity, his theology, and his psychology. He could help me. Oh, by the way, it's all your fault that I had to go for that counseling anyway. So stressed out. Just want to let you know that, remind you. But it's so beautiful what God can do. Wow, what has he done in Brian and Krista's life? So please tell the people you love that God can strengthen their weaknesses too.